Good day, Grinder School. We're carrying on with the How to Master Heads-Up Sit and Go series. We're in part 3, where we're going to be concentrating on betting strategies and sizings. So, we're going to be covering pre-flop default bet sizes. We'll talk a bit about some betting faux pas. Things we want to avoid, and we'll also talk about limping strategies, playing against limps, and post-flop bet sizing and what considerations we put into that. So pre-flop, while we're deep between 50 and 75 big blinds deep, we're going to be generally betting 3 big blinds. This is in general a good sizing in that it forces the villain to fold out some of his range usually, or it punishes him for calling with too wide of a range. It also allows us, of course, with our stronger range to get more value throughout the hands. However, as we get more shallow, it's important to kind of lower that range. One of the advantages of deeper stacked structures is that you can control the pot size to an extent where it's not necessarily a very shovey type of play, and this will increase the skill factor, which will increase your ROI in general in deeper stack games. So we in no way want to make it so that we have too low of an SPR until we have to. So really it's to our advantage, and in fact against some villains it's probably an effective strategy to min raise throughout, but we want to keep a pretty aggressive game going in general. So we're going to be doing the 3 big blinds down to 50, and then we'll cut down to 2.5, and then once we get short stacked down at 25 big blinds or less, we'll switch to 2 big blind opens. It's really important to note when we're playing against villains that consistently have a 3 big blind open, especially once we get below 25 big blinds. Our ranges have to change quite a bit. In the later videos where I start talking about short stack play, you can call a 2 big blind open fairly wide. We're going to shrink that range significantly. It's also notable that against a villain that has a very value heavy 3-bet big blind open, once you get shallow, can really be exploited, and you can play hands a lot more value hands a lot more heavy-handedly than you would against somebody who had a more merged range. As an example, if you have, say, ace jack and somebody does a 3 big blind open, or even say jacks or queens or kings or even aces, against somebody that you have strong reason to believe has a strong 3 big blind open, you can pretty much jam all your strong value hands over and expect a call. So that's important to remember. Also, again, something I get into a bit in the short stack video, one of the adjustments you make as you get more short stacked is that you take value hands that would normally be a call, and you turn them into a jam for value, simply because it's not profitable to simply flat call with them. And people that have larger bet sizes force you to do that a lot sooner. So that's why I note here that if somebody's doing a 4 or 5 big blind open, there's not as many hands that you can flat with, and really some of them you're going to be jamming over a bit. So an important thing to remember when you're opening is varying your raise sizes in general. You want to avoid doing, particularly if you're doing it based on the value of your hands. When I'm playing against a regular who isn't very good, but I know is a bit aware of, is situationally aware, I will often, for example, instead of doing a 3x open, I might do a 3.5x open, but that is usually done with a variety of a range, just to kind of take advantage that he might be nittier against a larger bet size. Against opponents that don't seem to adjust at all to a varying raise size, it would be fine to do larger opens against them. But at the same time, you need an awful lot of hands to kind of get that sense. Plus, there's always a chance that villains might start counter adjusting to your larger raise sizes and smaller raise sizes with weaker hands. So in general, we're just going to keep to our 3 big blind, 2.5 big blind, 2 big blind strategy at the various depths. Another thing we're going to avoid is limping for no reason as a base strategy. So if we decide that we want to limp a hand at any time in a match, it's fine. But we're not going to be limping a large range unless we have a reason to. In other words, unless we found something that makes it profitable to do. Against somebody that's going to be folding to our limp stabs a ton of the time, we'll widen our limping range to include junkier hands. In general, limping hands are going to be, well, I'll get into limping in a bit. And again, another big mistake people make is not basing their decisions on effective stacks. This really comes into play short stacked, but should never be taken for granted at any depth. So always keep in mind that the only stack size that matters is the lowest stack on the board, and your ranges should be based on that entirely. And if being short stacked or even large stacks may seem more nitty, you should really identify that as a leak, simply because you are simply losing value, and you should always take advantage of fold equity in situations where you're short stacked effectively, and not start knitting it up. You should go in for the kill if you're a big stack, and you should try to aggressively double up if you're a short stack. So I was talking a bit about limping. Again, our default limp range is going to consist of medium strength hands that hit the flop well. They're not going to be the high end of the medium strength range. Hands like Jack 10 suited, for example, we're still going to open with, but a hand like Jack 8 offsuit might be fine. A lot of gap suited connectors would be fine as well. In general, we're not going to be limping with hands like Ace 2 offsuit or King 4 offsuit, and this is simply because they're not going to hit a flop very often very well, and also because they have more value opening due to fold equity in general, and also because when they hit the flop, they're usually the best hand. Also, strong value hands we're never going to limp in for no reason. An important thing to remember too, one of the reasons why we aren't going to limp a hand like Ace 2 offsuit is that it has no fold equity. We could start limping in junkier hands if our limp stabs are working very well. And again, I have a note here, if you limp you must stab. So in general, I'd say 90% of the time when you limp, you're going to be c-betting. You could avoid certain boards, low card connected boards, for example, if you don't hit at all. But in general, you're going to stab a ton. That's generally the purpose of limping, and a limping strategy rather. When we're playing against somebody who's limping a ton, we definitely have to be punishing more often. However, as a default, we're only going to be punishing with strong hands, Ace X, King 9 plus, Queen 10, Jack 10 suited, and high pairs. And this is simply because there's no reason to really get spewy against a limp range, and until we understand how they play post-flop, it's not necessarily an advantage to just start punishing wild. Plus, in general, people that limp a lot will counter-adjust if you are consistently punishing them. So while it's important to punish a lot, we want to mix in strategies such as check raising on the flop or donk betting on the flop in order to effectively keep people that limp a lot guessing. So again, all of our stronger hands we're going to be wanting to see a flop with, like 8-9 suited, 8-10 suited, or 10-8 suited. And in general, we don't want to overplay those hands. And we can add a lot of junky hands again to our limping range if our villain is going to be folding a ton. Yeah. So again, a note. We should be seeing doing donk leads and check raises a fair amount, and that includes with our value range as well. Although these don't necessarily need to be balanced. And again, we don't want to be going overboard attacking limps. It gets villains will often, if they feel like they're being picked on, start limp raising and that sort of thing, especially when we get shallow. And in general, the shallower we get, the easier it is, because when we decide to punish limps, we start jamming. But again, it's not something we want to overdo, and it's even more important that we have a value range in there for the times that villains are trying to trap us. One thing also worth mentioning about limping in general is that I don't think that you should even try incorporating too many limps in your range when you're starting playing these formats, simply because it's really easy, especially for starting players, to start playing too passively. And that lack of fold equity the limping has, plus your inability to represent many hands on a flop, can really backfire depending on your post-flop ability. So post-flop, while we're deeper, and by deeper I just mean simply anything above 25, 30, we're going to be betting 2/3 as a standard C bet on most boards. However, on dry boards we can make our bet significantly smaller, and say half pot in a lot of cases, maybe even less. And on wet boards we can make it larger, like 3/4, etc. Both for value and as a bluff. Although again, those ranges do not have to be balanced depending on the type of villain we're playing against. As we get shallower, we can we'll reduce our C bet down to 1/2 pot, and simply because people can't really float profitably with this wider range, and we can even C bet as low as 1/4 pot on dry boards, both for value to induce and as a bluff. Paired boards are a really good example of that. 25 big blinds deep, our standard C bet on a paired board can be about 1/3, I would say, anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2, but in general we want to take advantage of the fact that most people aren't going to play back when they don't hit, especially at the micro and low stakes. Now, donk betting is a very underused strategy in a lot of forms of poker, I find, simply because it doesn't get a lot of respect. But in general, we're going to be donk betting with a hand that's too weak to check call. That could include draws, weak draws like gut shots. It could also be middle and low pair hands on boards that are a little bit nerve-wracking, and against villains that are likely to try to barrel us off if we simply check call. Again, donk bettings work well with a strong hand, and it says here on a wet board versus a villain that isn't likely to raise when checked to. That's very true. It's also good for inducing. Some people will play back a lot when you donk bet, simply because you're representing a weaker range. Thinker players knowing that a lot of people will do it with like bottom pair type hands, middle pairs, and draws, so they will play back on it from time to time. And also a huge value from them is taking away pots on both dry and wet boards. A lot of the time against more passive players, and because donk betting gets less respect, you'll often have to barrel, and you can take advantage of those tendencies sometimes to get an extreme amount of value by donking, but it's not something that you want to overdo too often. Alright, so here are a few hands to kind of go over some of the concepts we've talked so far about. On this board here, with the pot the way it is and how short stack we are, we don't really want to be check calling here, since our equity isn't high enough. If we were a little deeper, we could try a smaller check raise. The perfect solution in general is to donk out on here, maybe 100 chips. 120 would be fine as well. As it is, we check and we get bet into, and in spite of our equity and the fact that this particular villain probably doesn't hit this board a lot, we're kind of forced to fold or check raise. But the problem with check raising here is that if we do get jammed on, we pretty much have to fold. So the better line would definitely be a donk bet in this particular situation versus this villain. And in this hand here, a really dry board, we give a standard half pot c-bet just because we expect a lot of people to be tempted to call with a bunch of straight draws in this particular situation. But in general, he's going to fold everything else. To be honest, he could probably reduce this bet size a little bit to 100 chips, and he'll get folds enough time to justify it. Alright, in this one, the villain limps. We punish to a 4 times size here. We're likely to do this with most ace-x hands. We can just go up to just a regular 3x with the rest of our range for doing this. There's no need to balance that against a lot of villains. So in other words, if we had a hand like say king 9 offsuit, we might just bump it up to 3x. But we're definitely going to always go to 4x or maybe even 4.5x with our ace-x type hands, simply because it's really hard out of position to get value when we do hit the board. And we're definitely going to c-bet pretty much any flop, especially a flop as dry as this one, relative to our opponent's perceived range. And here we have a villain that 4x's us, in spite of us having ace-6 suited, which is a relatively good hand. Against the villain, this particular villain has shown to have a stronger 3x range, so his 4x range is probably going to be fairly strong as well. Our best case scenario here is that he has a small pair, and occasionally he might have a smaller ace-x, but in general we're going to play relatively conservatively. A fold there would be fine. A6 is suited in particular is a relatively strong hand though, so we decide to call. And when we get in bet into, especially at this size, we can assume that we're beat. Obviously there are plenty of villains here that would kind of spew off on a dry board there, hoping to get us to fold. Better hands when they're doing this with air, but I believe that he probably does have a pretty strong range there. And here we're getting 3x. We have king 7 suited, 34 big blinds deep. Just because, again, this particular villain is shown to have a pretty strong 3x range, we don't really want to get into a situation where we're dominated with our king x suited, and king 7 isn't really worth calling here either, so we just fold. And on this board, we could do a slightly like a half pot c-bet here. We elect to go a little bit lower, hoping to keep jacks and draws in, or perhaps get him to spew. We expect him to fold a ton of the time here, which is why we go for a smaller c-bet. When we get donked into here, we could elect to raise it up. This is a pretty common spot though for a villain to donk into us with a lower pair. He could also be doing this with air, knowing that our range here is particularly weak. Obviously our intent was to take a stab there. We have too much equity to just give up. Even with this 105 chip bet, his range isn't all that likely to hit there. However, this river bet we kind of have to give up here. He could have a king x in his range. He could have hit 2 pair. It's really hard to tell. This particular villain was playing really straightforward. I might make a hero call there against certain aggressive villains. As we can see, he actually did hit 2 pair. So, and here I probably should have raised it up to 100 chips instead of just 90. and we elect to do a 2/3 c-bet. We can't really do any less than this just because of the texture of the board. And when he raises it up here, we have no choice but to get it in. Even at these depths, we're way ahead of a lot of his range. If he does have another king, we have him dominated, and a lot of his flush draws will be obligated to call, and some of them will be a flip against, but in this particular case, he folds, which is good for us. And on this board here, because it was so dry, due to our depth, I decided to do a little bit more than a 1/3 c-bet. If we were shallower, I would be betting a third on a board like this, and we get a fold. And again, a villain with a stronger 3x range. We decided to check here. In a situation where we didn't perceive him to have a strong range, we might donk out here, but we're kind of obligated to check call at least one street, and when he bets again, we're unfortunately forced to fold, simply because his range will contain a ton of aces, but we are obligated to call the first bet just because he will occasionally miss. Plus, of course, we could hit 2-pair, but that's not a major concern. Again, a relatively dry board, so we decided to go for a less than half pot bet. Alright, and this 3-bet is a really small size, so at these stacks we're going to be calling there. We'll get more into 3-bets later, but he's giving us really good odds to call. And when we hit the second pair, it seems very unlikely that he wouldn't c-bet a king there, so our worst case scenario, we're in a draw. We decided to check back here. I think that actually a bet of say 240 would be fine here, and we have a better 10, so we missed some thin value in this particular hand. And here's another good limping hand. And for whatever reason, the stars bet buttons aren't working the way they were before the last update. I probably would bet 40 chips there or 30 chips there at the very least, just because it's a limp pot, and I'd expect a ton of floats on that board. Because this is a lower ace, I still think that we should have been betting 80 chips here. And half pot c-bet on the dry flop at this depth is plenty. You're going to get tons of folds against most villains. So that's where we're going to leave things for today. So obviously there are a lot of considerations for bet size besides bet texture, and that includes your opponent's perceived range. You should always look for both chances to pay less for a bluff whenever possible, and chances to extract maximum value on a flop. Keep in mind the texture and the opponent's tendencies at all times. I hope you guys found this useful. I'm looking forward to any comments in the forums. Until the next video, I'm signing off.